against interest. He's going back to the teachings of our Christianity. I mean, you cannot have a system based on this. But he had to back off later due to public pressure. And so then later on, it wasn't interest, or it was usury. So if you had excessive interest, it was considered prohibited, but a small amount, 5% or so, was considered okay. But the Muslims have stuck to the principle. The other feature of our system is we don't allow transactions where is a fixed return regardless of risk. And so, especially in the lending of money, because our principle is money just doesn't beget money. And so, if the sheikh has a business, I don't give him, here's 100,000 to run your business, and by the way, in 10 years you're giving me $110,000 or $150,000 back, no matter what the business does, good or bad. It's too bad if it goes there. I owe the money. And so, and this is a structural problem we think, and I think, in the whole economic system we have. One of the biggest markets in the world are the bond markets. And trillions upon trillions of dollars, small rates, adjustments in interest rate causes massive economic upheaval. And so if you look at the Islamic system, there's the risk sharing, there's profit sharing, there's upside and upside. If you have an economic system which is based on those who own the wealth and can always demand the interest rate, no matter what happens economically, whether business is good or not, this, we think, becomes a structural problem with the economy. And there's an excellent book we were just discussing. We're going to have an anthropologist here. This book was written by an anthropologist in the London School of Economics, Graeber, who wrote a book which is called Debt, a 5,000-year history. Fascinating book. I told some of my colleagues in Toronto to read it, and then they looked at the book and it was like 600 or so pages. It's a huge book, and so they said, Rehan, you don't read books that big, and so why don't you read it and we'll do a podcast on it. So that's what ended up happening, and so I just ended up reading the book, and we just had a podcast on it. It's somewhere out there, if Risk-wise is the podcast, and so they had the interview. And so, and this book is probably the most interesting analysis on debt and the concept of riba as we have it in Islam. Sometimes hard to translate as interest because it's basically, let's call it a loan on money, just for simplicity. The history of slavery, and this is one of the theses of this book. If you look at the history of slavery, the history of oppression has involved debt throughout history. At the Arabs' time, they actually gave interest-free loans. So I would give my friend an interest-free loan, and of course, if he doesn't pay it, he owes me $10,000, then it suddenly becomes 20. And now you got another year. And if it doesn't, then you end up enslaving him, family, for generations and generations. And this, historically, has been the case right across human society. Look at slavery, oppression, etc. It's unbelievable, the linkages to debt. And even if you look at the explorers and the colonialists that came to, for example, North America and South America, many of those guys that came here had to borrow money to come here. And then they were on these ships. They basically enslaved the locals in the Americas, the indigenous people here, and they ended up looting the resources here to help pay off the debts they had incurred to get here, and they ended up enslaving the people here, etc., on and on. It's been the history here. If you look at the caste system in India, where you had basically lower caste people, and the caste system being enslaved for generation among generations, and that it was just their lot in life, and you see that now. You see that in places, even Muslim countries, in Pakistan, the feudal system that has existed in many places. So you have these slaves that have been enslaved because of deaths of their grandfathers, etc. So the thesis of this book is that has this 5,000-year recorded history, and this interest on loans, has been the cause of human misery right across. And now you have an economic system based on that, which has been, we think, the roots of many of the instability, many of the income inequalities that we see, many of the income distribution, and of course, this leads to a lot of conflict, which we're heading into. It's interesting, one lecture which I saw on YouTube, it's the ex-head of the IMF, and he was giving a lecture at Stanford University. And I think this explains a lot on what we're seeing now. The rise of the far right, whether it's in the US and in Europe. But you're seeing this economic shift. And this economic shift has a lot of implications globally, has it certainly among the Muslim world. Previously, a couple of books have come out which are very interesting on the British occupation of India at the time. Most people don't realize how rich and wealthy India was, sort of when the Mughal Empire was there. In fact, before the British came, India and China both had about 1/3 of the world economy. When they left, it actually went down to about 3%. Literacy rate among the Muslims was about 100%, most places in India. When they left, it went down to 20%, documented. The economic order, at least in this last century, was that the West would have 80% of the world's resources. So if you're looking now, let's say about 1 billion people, we control about 80% of the world's resources. And the 20% was the remainder of the world. The other 7 billion people, 6-7 billion people would share the 20%. That was the economic model. When this guy was the head of the IMF, World Bank, assumed that the world would operate under. And of course, this is the remnants of hundreds of years of colonialism and imperialism. So now it's shifting. And in the future, the world will see the West remain stagnant in population growth, 1.1 million, etc. The remainder of the world will add a couple more billion people. And the shift of economic power from that 80%, they believe will drop to about 35%. And then 65% will shift. And countries that used to be economic powers, historically now like China and India, etc., others, Asian countries, are going to get back. Yeah. And of course, that would mean a very significant decline, at least relative decline, in standards of living in some parts of the West, especially among those who had jobs that were now taken away by jobs in China or India, etc. So that one factory worker who loses here, there's 3 to 5 who get middle class levels of living there. So you have this economic shift that's causing enormous conflict. How do you sort of solve those type of movements that are happening? Once again, if you go to the philosophical sort of foundation, whereas the imperialist, colonialist type of thinking and mentality that we've had, which is really not based on any religious tradition, is based on exploitation, Darwin's survival of the fittest, and we try to take what we can. If you look at the writings of, for example, Winston Churchill, and they actually took some of these excerpts out of his books because they don't want it published, and he basically said, we have basically had this high standard of living in the West by exploiting other countries, using violence, etc. And he goes, we're not innocent. And sort of like when Trump's response, when the reporter asked him about, why are you so friendly with the Russians? They're killers. And he said, well, aren't we killers too? No. So at least he was open on that. He was, we're not innocent. Everyone else is doing it too. So Churchill writes that we're not innocent. And we've used violence to justify, but we've achieved incredible economic success and a standard of living. A lot on the backs of countries like India, which they robbed and pillaged most of their resources for hundreds of years. That was the economic system that we have has been built on. What was Canada built on? That's our history here. So that's the foundations of the economic system in the current world order. Those of faith, those of ethics, those of humanism, there has to be a better solution than this sort of, antagonistic, confrontational, us against them type of mentality. Where the Islamic system comes in is the concept of universal brotherhood, the concept of cooperation, the concept that those who have wealth and power have a responsibility to take care of the poor. Those who are struggling or orphaned, etc., are taken care of. And that's part of it. But at a more higher level is that the resources we have are not just for one group or a select set of multinational corporations. They're for humanity. And that they're not only for exploitation, to just make money. The Islamic system puts moral filters on our actions. So they have to be socially responsible in terms of type of investments we can do. We have to protect the environment. We have to do our best to make sure that people have decent wages and living conditions. Part of the Islamic economic system is that the government ensures that people not only have decent opportunities for employment, place to live, etc. These were systems that were imposed. And if you actually look at the time of even Umar ibn Khattab, when he was the Khalifa, he had what they had, a child benefit system. He had that type of system there at that time. When they would give allowances to families as their children got older, they would get more. They would get taken care of. You would have many elements, and if you look at the system that we have now, not to say the whole system, of course, in the Western system is corrupt. There's obviously many good examples of it, or what is in the system. But however, the fundamental philosophy of why we do this is different. An interesting thing is on how we treat those who are in financial trouble. There was an American CEO who was doing business in Saudi Arabia. And he wanted to know what happened if that Saudi business went bankrupt. So what are bankruptcy laws of Saudi Arabia? This was a couple decades ago. And then he brought in this Muslim scholar, was a Harvard-trained lawyer, knew Islamic finance a bit, he knew Sharia, and he said, okay, let me just check. And so Saudi Arabia didn't actually at that time have a law of what happens if there's a bankruptcy. But what it does have, the Saudi law, and I'm not sure if it's changed now, but it says if there's nothing in our laws that are written, many of the current laws we have in Muslim countries are imported elsewhere, commercial laws. He goes, if you can't find anything, go to this Ibn Qudama fiqh manual. Whatever the fiqh manual says, that's our law. If you can't find it in our written law. So the CEO goes, okay, go translate the chapter on bankruptcy for us. So a scholar just translated the chapter on bankruptcy for the Ibn Qudama. And this is a very famous Hanbali jurist fiqh manual. And he gave it to the American CEO. And he read it. And he said, okay, it looks like your Ibn Qudama guy there, it looks like he copied chapter 11, from our bankruptcy laws. And then I was laughing because the Muslim scholar had to tell the guy, by the way, that was written about 700 years ago. So and in fact, the bankruptcy laws that we have, Chapter 11, actually were derived from Sharia. And in fact, if you look at many elements actually of English common law in business transactions, a lot of them were derived from Islam. And in fact, if you look at the banking system, the original checking systems came from the Arabs. The original merchant structures that were set up in Venice and parts of Italy in the 1200s took a lot of their contractual structures and stuff, which they learned from the Arabs and trade in that. So the parts of justice, taking care of those in need, taking care of those who were bankrupt, etc., part of the system, were coming from the Islamic economic system. If you look at historically, that's why during the time of the Muslim world, we actually had very little fluctuations in terms of the business cycle as we do now with the riba or the current economic system. You actually had a lot of the poverty issues, income distribution issues that we're having right now, not as prevalent. And because the thinking behind this, the philosophy behind it, is that this wealth and the system we have is a trust for human beings. It's not something which we can exploit and use for advantage over other societies, etc. And so those are, like I said, the high-level fundamental principles. What that leads to in Islamic finance are socially responsible investment tools, ways where we can do business with each other and share risk, as well as share reward. The prevention of exploitative type of financial relationships, and clarity in the way we do business. You know, part of the crisis that we had in the subprime crisis in the U.S. that led to the housing crisis was people had no idea what they were investing into. They had no idea when they were putting all their money into these type of real estate bonds, you know, that there was